Thanks for joining us.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. You are now tuned in to this episode of our podcast. Today, we are going to interview some of the greatest and most influential minds in our field. And now, please welcome your host.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And we're back. With us once again, Bobby Rechnitz is a Los Angeles-based philanthropist, real estate developer who serves as the chairman of the Golda Meir Commemorative Coin Committee and the Abraham Accords Roundtable. Has written a fascinating op-ed on JNS, Jewish News Syndicate, about Ehud Barak harming the war effort. Welcome back. Good to see you again. Good to have you back on the air, Bobby.
Thank you, Zev. Good to be here, although under very unfortunate circumstances.
Everybody's still concerned about the war. So what makes you so upset about Ehud Barak?
I think that it takes a certain minimum amount.
Israel, yeah.
Sorry?
Former Prime Minister of Israel.
Former Prime Minister of Israel, exactly. And that's the reason that I wrote the article. He has a certain recognition in the outside world, in the international media, because he's a former Prime Minister. And I think he's taken advantage of that to be heard outside of Israel, because frankly, I don't believe that he's relevant in Israel. But when he reaches out to CNN, especially Christian Amanpour, we already know that from the beginning, it's not going to be a good ending for Israel. But when he uses that as a platform to criticize the government, to criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu, to criticize all the unity in Israel, and to even imply, which he did in November, an interview with her, that Israel actually built the tunnels under the Al-Shifa hospital, it just goes too far. The man is putting his own personal grievances and agenda before the people of Israel. He was a military leader. He was chief of staff. From a strategic point, let alone a political point, and certainly a Jewish conscience point, he should not be doing this.
Now, by the way, did you verify, until I saw your article, I never even saw the fact that Israel was even involved in building the underground bunkers underneath the Shifra hospital in Gaza. Is there any basis to that?
I don't believe it's a fact. I believe it's something that Ehud Barak said. If, in fact, there was some accuracy for some reason to that, I think it undermines the entire war effort and all the strategy of going against those tunnels and pointing out that they're beneath the hospitals. Certainly, Israel is not responsible for Hamas, as he says, and they never aided and abetted Hamas.
Well, actually, I think that at some point that Israel did use Hamas as a counterweight to the Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization. So they saw that as a counterbalance. So I think they did help at one point. Doesn't excuse anything that Hamas has done, but in the political games that you have to play to undermine your worst enemy, at that time Yasser Arafat was a worse enemy than Hamas.
That's very true, and Hamas did overtake and get rid of Arafat, but at the same time, no one wanted them to take over the Palestinian Authority. With the Palestinian Authority, we had a supposed partner.
Right. Well, I mean, there's really very little difference between Fatah, Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, except one wears business suits and one does not wear business suits, right? But ideologically, they're not that far apart, even though the West would love, in fact, isn't that what our government is saying? Let's have a Palestinian state, and we're going to reconstitute the Palestinian Authority.
It's pretty much, excuse the phrase, it's pretty much a regurgitation of all the old policies that never worked. You have to learn from experience. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Israel now is going through a terrible cycle where we always thought that never again was reality, and now it's only a dream because this happened again. I think the ideologues in the United States, around the world, who don't understand the Middle East, or think they do, and think that a two-state solution is actually a solution, the word two states, those two words, and solution shouldn't be in the same sentence.
Well, I say there already is a two states. Jordan, in the facto, is a Palestinian state, about 80-90% of the inhabitants. In fact, the Jordan has carved out what should have been Israel under the Balfour Declaration historically.
That's very accurate. And again, the people who call themselves Palestinians are welcome to live in any country in the world, especially in Arab countries, who should be welcoming them instead of closing the doors. That's where the focus should be.
Now, you were upset that Ehud Barak is speaking outside of Israel, criticizing the government. fascinating. He has been undermining the government with judicial reform. He's been working overseas in the United States and elsewhere to undermine the government and dealing with the judicial reform issues. So this is nothing new. But what I find fascinating, there used to be a rule that Israeli leaders, and I believe it includes ex-leaders and ex-prime ministers, don't criticize the Israeli government when they're overseas. They leave the criticism within the country. I asked Ehud Barak about this, and he says, well, things have changed, and he claims Bibi's behind it, but he says it's okay to criticize Israel outside the country. And I think that's a massive sea of change, which it didn't ordinarily used to be the case.
I think if when someone like Ehud Barak, he's also one of the great spokesmen, ex-prime ministers, that, we can be very proud of, and I say that facetiously. When people like that speak up and they say that it's different, it's not true. In Israel, we know the gloves come off. People can say what they can. You ever go into the Knesset, you'll understand exactly what it is to be in disputed territory. But no one should go outside in the world, especially the United States. When Bibi Netanyahu was in the opposition, he was the go-to person in times of conflict for all the news stations because he made the case for Israel. He did not make it political. He talked about it strategically, and he performed hasbara. He did what's good for Israel. He did not criticize anyone sitting in office. And so when Ehud Barak points to Bibi Netanyahu, I think that Barak needs to really self-reflect, because mudslinging doesn't get you anywhere. He's a disgraced former prime minister. All he did is bring disgrace upon the country and upon himself after being a potential good, strong leader. And when Ehud Barak is trying to be destructive within Israel and outside of Israel, he lost that fight with the civil disobedience, the civil war, because unfortunately the war broke out. And now he's doing something else. I don't want to get involved in mudslinging, but I would think that when an individual who was a disgraced prime minister who failed at everything that he did, and on top of it, he's got his problems now with Jeffrey Epstein and other areas that I don't want to go to. Does he really need to be blowing the horn against the own country of Israel? He's not doing it against Netanyahu. It's much more personal. He's harming Israel.
What's fascinating is that Ehud Barak and Bibi Netanyahu, I believe Bibi served under him in the army. So they have a relationship, complicated, and they served in a government where they were both one government where they were both together for, I think, 2 or 3 years. So they have a complex relationship, but there is no question that he'd like to undermine the Bibi Netanyahu government and like to see a different government. No question about it.
Look, the fact is that when Barak was basically washed up, for lack of a better term, and Labor didn't get any votes and he couldn't make it into the government, it was Bibi Netanyahu that extended his hand and brought him back into the government and made him a defense minister. So, we have a saying of Hakarat Tov. That's Ehud Barak's Hakarat Tov. I'm sorry to say that I think his fingerprint was not only in a lot of the conflict of Israel. I think as investigations start to open up after the war, unfortunately, we're going to see his fingerprint in a lot of areas where he had no business being involved.
Are you saying that regarding security and regarding the Hamas penetration of Israel, you're saying that he had a hand in that?
I wouldn't go so far. I would say that I believe that he had a hand in security.
Well, I think all the prime ministers going back decades probably had a hand in tolerating Hamas. I mean, the fact is, though, that they were told that Hamas is going to be doing some dastardly deed. They ignored it. They felt that Hamas was into getting money, and they were lulled by it. I think that's what's going to come out, and this is true probably of successive governments.
I believe a lot more will come out about Ehud Barak and the problems that he tried to create during this civil obedience over the Supreme Court. I think he looked in other areas to try to stir up trouble for the country. I'm very sorry to have to say that.
What was the reaction to your article in JNS?
I've only had about 7 or 8 Knesset members reach out to me, many of them on the left. Everyone thought it was a positive, very accurate, very true article.
Again, there should be a rule in place, and it's hard to enforce that if you're an Israeli leader or ex-Israeli leader, when you're outside the state of Israel, you should not be criticizing your country.
Well, he's doing it from inside Israel, but he's reaching to the outside media because he's irrelevant in Israel. So he's just trying to stir up problems.
You're right about the interviews with CNN, but he was here in the United States with judicial reform, raising money and attacking Israel. Ehud Barak, who I interviewed a couple of times, was in this country criticizing Israel.
Right.
So there's a tendency to criticize Israel when you're overseas. But you're right, in this particular case, he was in Israel, so I guess he would be allowed under the rules of engagement, I guess. But
Well,
it's a time of war. It's a time
let
of
him
war.
speak to the Israeli press. Anyone knows if you're going to be interviewed with Christiane Amanpour, she won't even report anything that's pro-Israel. It's just a non-starter. He knew
Correct.
exactly what he was doing. You know, he put on his chief of staff. He was a very good chief of staff, but unfortunately, he was a failed politician.
Bobby Rechnitz, philanthropist from Los Angeles, thank you for joining with us, and look forward to having you back. Any interesting projects that coming under your purview?
Well, we're still working on the Golda Meir commemorative coin, where we have overwhelming support in Congress. We think it's one of the most important things right now to have a unifying and non-partisan factor in the United States government showing support of Israel. I happen to be going to Washington this week to lobby senators and congresspeople on both sides of the aisle to make sure that they permanently suspend funding to UNRWA and they unwind UNRWA. That's one of the most important thorns in the side of Israel and on the side of democracy and on the side of Democrats who live in the United States and consider this a democratic and free society.
You know something, you start me on UNRWA. They have no reason for existence. I've said this many times on this broadcast, and I'll repeat it now. United Nations Relief and Work Organization was meant to perpetuate Palestinian refugeeism. The truth is, according to the United Nations Charter, after every conflict, they're mandated to get rid of the refugees to make sure they're absorbed in different countries. So at some point, there are no refugees left. There's no refugees left from World War II, for example. Only one exception. The Palestinian Arabs, they're perpetuated, and UNRWA should not be existing. They should be absorbed in the countries. There should not be refugee camps. And the fact is, though, that UNRWA always has been a thorn in the side of Israel. In 1967, we reported years ago, they actually fought Israel. Some of their staff fought Israel. Hamas has used them for decades to ferret weapons and people. So what's happening now in the conflict is nothing new. It's been there before.
Exactly.
But I hope your success. I hope we can get UNRWA out of business. I don't want them just defunded.
They need to be unwound. They've served
Correct.
whatever purpose they may have had, they've already served and exhausted.
I don't think they have really had a purpose, but okay. Bobby, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, the pulse beat of the Jewish community.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.